All right, today we are unpacking a geopolitical drama that just exploded onto the world stage, and it happened shockingly fast. We're talking about a direct head-to-head diplomatic clash between the United States and South Africa. And this isn't just some political spat. No, this is about deep-seated history, shifting global alliances, and a colossal economic relationship that is now, quite literally, hanging by a thread. $14 billion. I want you to just let that number sink in for a second, because it is at the absolute heart of everything we're about to discuss. This is the value of the annual trade between the US and South Africa, an economic lifeline that is now experiencing a massive earthquake. As we go through this whole story, remember this number. Every single decision is being weighed against. So how on earth did we get here? Well, it all kicked off on one single chaotic day, January 3rd, 2026. At 4 a.m. Eastern, the news breaks. The U.S. has launched a massive military operation in Venezuela. Operation Absolute Resolve, they called it. But while the rest of the world was still scrambling to figure out what was happening, South Africa, they didn't wait. By 11 a.m. their time, boom, they issued a fierce, blistering public condemnation. And just like that, you had an instant, incredibly tense standoff with the White House. The speed of that reaction, that's the first clue that something much deeper is going on. So to really get our heads around this, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at this standoff itself and why it's so genuinely shocking. Then we're going to dig into the history, the ideology that's really driving South Africa's move. After that, we'll zoom out to the global game of alliances. We'll also flip the script and see this whole thing from Washington's point of view. And finally, we'll come right back to that massive, all-important $14 billion question. And this really brings us to the core mystery of it all. I mean, look, South Africa is a country facing enormous problems at home. We're talking a staggering 32% unemployment rate. They have crippling rolling blackouts because the power grid is failing. There are deep, deep social issues. So the question is, why? Why would a government dealing with all of that risk its single most critical trade relationship with the West over something happening thousands of miles away? And that's really the question at the heart of this entire explainer. Are we looking at a bold act of principled leadership here? Is South Africa standing up for international law no matter the cost? Or is this a catastrophic miscalculation, a reckless, ideological gamble that could send its already fragile economy right over the cliff? The answer, as you're about to see, is anything but simple. Okay, so let's start with South Africa's official story. To really understand why their condemnation was so fast and so fierce, we have to rewind the clock a bit and look at the country's own past and really the political DNA of its ruling party, the ANC. So if you read their official statement, the language is very deliberate. It's formal, it's legalistic. They frame this as a simple defense of global order, citing the UN Charter, condemning unilateral actions. On the surface, it looks like they're just playing the role of the responsible global citizen, defending the international rulebook. But when you dig just a little bit deeper, you hit on something one analyst called ideological muscle memory. You have to remember, the ANC's entire identity was forged fighting against apartheid. And back then, their biggest allies weren't the Western powers. They were socialist states like Cuba and the Soviet Union. So for them, when a phrase like US intervention comes up, it triggers a kind of historical reflex. This anti-imperialist stance isn't just a talking point, it's baked into their political DNA. Okay, but here's where the plot thickens. How consistently is this principle actually applied? Because this is where critics start pointing to what they call selective outrage, and they begin asking why this specific US action got such a massive response when so many other global crises haven't. I mean, think about it. The response was immediate and harsh. But critics are asking, where was that same fire for the devastating conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region? What about the military coup in Myanmar, or the civil war in Sudan, or for that matter, Russia's annexation of Crimea? This apparent inconsistency makes you wonder if there's something else at play here, beyond just abstract principles. And that something else is our cue to zoom out and look at the giant chessboard of global geopolitics. Because this decision wasn't made in a bubble. It was made by a country that is a very important player in a very specific international club. That club is BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This group is making it very clear that it wants to be a counterweight to a world dominated by the United States. So for South Africa, condemning a unilateral U.S. military action isn't just about Venezuela. It's about signaling their commitment to this other team, to this emerging new world order. And This table right here, it just lays it out in black and white. It's stunning. Look at who condemned the U.S. action. South Africa. Right there with its BRICS partners, China and Russia, and their close allies, Iran and Cuba. And on the other side, the supporters. Key U.S. allies like Argentina, Israel, and Ukraine. This shows that South Africa didn't just release a press statement. It very publicly picked a side in a global tug of war. And you know, this alignment isn't just talk. It's getting military. South Africa has actually been participating in joint naval exercises with Russia, China, and Iran. They call them Will for Peace. Now, when you're running war games with countries the U.S. considers its primary adversaries, your diplomatic statements suddenly carry a whole lot more weight. It's a sign of a much deeper strategic relationship. So how does all of this look from the other side of the ocean? Well, let's just say Washington has a very different interpretation. From their perspective, this isn't about international law. It isn't even really about BRICS. For them, this is just the latest hostile act in a long, frustrating pattern from a country they increasingly see as an ungrateful partner. And right here, you see two worldviews that just cannot be reconciled. Where South Africa's government sees itself defending sovereignty and the rule of law, many in the U.S. see a clear anti-American agenda. Where South Africa sees solidarity with the oppressed, Washington sees a country that takes billions of dollars in benefits while actively cozying up to America's biggest rivals. And for Washington, this isn't just some random event. They see it as the last straw. They've got a whole list of grievances. They'll point to South Africa consistently voting against U.S. interests at the UN, its ambassador making inflammatory comments, its case against Israel at the ICC, and all of this is coming from a country that, by the way, enjoys a $9 billion trade surplus with the U.S. and gets $500 million in American aid every single year. Which brings us right back to where we started. Back to the cold, hard, real-world consequences. We've talked ideology, we've talked geopolitics, but now we have to face that number again. What does this political standoff actually mean for the South African economy? And more importantly, for the millions of ordinary people whose livelihoods depend on it? Well, the whole thing really hinges on this one piece of American law called AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Think of it as a golden ticket. It's what gives South African products, everything from cars to wine to fruit, special duty-free access to the gigantic U.S. market. But, and this is the absolutely critical part, AGOA is not a right, it's a privilege. It's granted by the U.S. Congress, and it can be taken away if a country is seen to be undermining American interests. And the stakes here are just breathtakingly high. You've got the $14 billion in trade, much of which depends on AGOA. You've got $500 million in vital aid. And all of that is being risked in a country already struggling with a 32% unemployment rate. The economic pain if the U.S. decides to retaliate, it wouldn't just be a headline. It would be felt in homes across the country. So what could actually happen? Well, the fallout could be a cascade. First, you'd have direct economic retaliation. The U.S. could pull AGOA, and jobs in farms and factories would just evaporate. Second, diplomatic isolation. South Africa could find itself pushed out of key groups like the G20. Third, it would become way more dependent on its BRICS partners, and it's not at all clear they could make up for the lost American trade. And finally, all that economic pain could easily fracture the country's fragile coalition government, which could lead to massive internal instability. So we end right back where we began, staring at this fundamental question. Was South Africa's decision an act of moral leadership, a principled, necessary stand for a new kind of world order, or was it an incredibly reckless gamble, an ideological choice made without regard for the economic well-being of its own people? The sources lay out both sides of the argument, but the final verdict, well, that's going to be written by the consequences that are still to come. And while all this matters is that it forces us all to ask a really tough question. When your principles clash with your pocketbook, what's the real price of picking a side?